Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to c4. Bishop f8 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Bishop c5 to b6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn e5 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Pawn d7 to d6. Pawn d4 to d5. Knight c6 to a5. Bishop c4 to b5, check. Bishop c8 to d7. Bishop b5 takes d7, check. Knight e5 takes d7. Castle kingside. Knight g8 to f6. Knight b1 to c3. Castle kingside. Bishop c1 to g5. Rook f8 to e8. Knight f3 to d4. Knight d7 to a5. Rook a1 to c1. Knight e5 to g4. Knight d4 to f5. Pawn a7 to a6. Pawn h2 to h3. Knight g4 to a5. Knight c3 to a4. Bishop b6 to a5. Pawn a2 to a3. Pawn b7 to b5. Pawn b2 to b4. Bishop a5 takes b4. Pawn a3 takes b4. Pawn b5 takes a4. Bishop g5 takes f6. Pawn g7 takes f6. Queen d1 takes a4. Rook a8 to b8. Queen a4 to a3. King g8 to h8. Rook c1 to c2. Rook b8 to b7. Queen a3 takes a6. Rook b7 takes b4. Rook f1 to c1. Rook b4 takes e4. Rook c2 takes c7. Rook e4 to e1, check. King g1 to h2. Rook e1 takes c1. Rook c7 takes c1. Queen d8 to b8. King h2 to g1. Rook e8 to d8. Pawn f2 to f4. Rook d8 to g8. King g1 to h1. Queen b8 to b2. Rook c1 to g1. Knight e5 to f3. Queen a6 to a1. Queen b2 takes a1. Rook g1 takes a1. Knight f3 to d2. Knight f5 takes d6. Rook g8 to f8. Rook a1 to e1. Knight d2 to b3. Knight d6 to e8. Knight b3 to c5. Pawn g2 to g4. Knight c5 to e6. Pawn d5 takes e6. Rook f8 takes e8. Pawn f4 to f5. Pawn f7 takes e6. Pawn f5 takes e6. King h8 to g7. King h1 to h2. King g7 to f8. King h2 to g3. King f8 to e7. Pawn h3 to h4. Rook e8 to c8. Pawn g4 to g5. Rook c8 to c3, check. King g3 to f4. Rook c3 to c4, check. King f4 to g3. Rook c4 to c3, check. King g3 to g4. Rook c3 to c4, check. King g4 to h5. Rook c4 to c5. King h5 to h6. Rook c5 to c4. Pawn h4 to h5. Pawn f6 takes g5. King h6 takes h7. Pawn g5 to g4. Pawn h5 to h6. Pawn g4 to g3. King h7 to g6. Pawn g3 to g2. Rook e1 to g1. Rook c4 to g4, check. King g6 to f5. Rook g4 to g3. Pawn h6 to h7. Rook g3 to h3. Rook g1 takes g2. Rook h3 takes h7. Rook g2 to g5. King e7 to d6. Rook g5 to g2. Rook h7 to h5, check. King f5 to f6. Rook h5 to h6, check. King f6 to f7. Rook h6 to h7, check. King f7 to g6. Rook h7 to e7. King g6 to f5. Rook e7 takes e6. Rook g2 to d2, check. King d6 to e7. Rook d2 to c2. Rook e6 to f6, check. King f5 to e5. Rook f6 to e6, check. King e5 to d5. Rook e6 to d6, check. King d5 to c5. Rook d6 to d1. Rook c2 to b2. King e7 to e6. Rook b2 to e2, check. King e6 to f5. Rook e2 to f2, check. King f5 to e4. Rook f2 to e2, check. King e4 to d3. Rook e2 to e5. Rook d1 to b1. King c5 to d5. Rook b1 to b5, check. King d5 to d6. Rook b5 to b6, check. King d6 to c5. Rook b6 to b1. King c5 to d5. Rook b1 to b5, check. King d5 to d6. Rook b5 to b4. King d6 to d5. Rook b4 to d4, check. King d5 to c5. Rook d4 to c4, check. King c5 to d5. Rook c4 to d4, check. King d5 to c5. Rook d4 to c4, check. King c5 to d5. Rook c4 to d4, check. The game is a draw.